Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. James Malazita. Thank you so much for watching this talk today. This talk is titled White Photorealism, Using STS or Science and Technology Studies to Bridge Long Histories of Blackness, Specularity, and Rendering. This talk is part of a larger project examining digital technologies, real-time rendering through the lens of the Unreal Engine, and thinking through how different elements of culture and race influence how we imagine, how we create digital technologies. So to begin, what is STS? So STS stands for Science and Technology Studies. It's an interdisciplinary field comprised of sociologists, historians, anthropologists, philosophers, and media studies scholars. The primary question motivating the field is, how do science and technology come to be, including what choices are made in the development of technologies and the exploration of science, and whose voices are heard and therefore not heard. Part of the underlining structures of STS is a rejection of ahistorical or scientistic narratives of science and technology. So what does this mean? STS assumes that science and technology comes from humans and therefore reflects human biases, human thought, and the systems of power that humans are always enraptured in. We also assume that science and technology can tell us as much about the cultures and practices that bring science and tech into being as they do about the world around us. Now, importantly, STS is not anti-science or in the mode of trying to debunk science, but actually argues for, as Bruno Latour says, a more realist science. One that does not take a naively objectivist approach to science and technology, one that doesn't assume that science is just automatically objective or that technology is automatically neutral, but rather acknowledge that science and tech are complicated and always situated and embedded in the human world. So this talk today is going to focus on the science and technology of race and computer graphics through Unreal's physically based rendering. And what I'm going to be looking at today is how race, computer graphics, and technologies of vision are co-produced. This means how they influence one another and how they are made to be together. Physically based rendering, or PBR, makes truth claims about the reality of the world, right? It makes claims about how the world looks, how light works, how surface works, how skin works. And these tech and truth claims, I'm going to argue, are entangled with longer histories of race, right? Again, if we're taking a historicist approach to science and technology, this means that truth claims are never universal and objective, but are always grounded in systems of power and perspective, right? So who's making the claim influences what the claim is. So what I'm going to argue that PBR's attempts at universality use what's called white empiricism, or the assumption that white ways of seeing and measuring are universal, especially when it comes to the Black body. Now, this is not to say that PBR is a bad technology or a racist technology or anything like that, but rather that pertains to rendering hair and skin through physically based rendering. We tend to assume a white body as taking primary scientific precedence over what looks correct. And as computer graphics researchers, as technologists, we have a collective responsibility to think more deeply about whose eyes, whose understandings, whose imaginations of the world and imaginations of skin and imaginations of color and light are being put at the foundation of this kind of universal system, right? Because remember, no system is ever universal. It's always enacted with and through technology. So Unreal's physically based materials are part of a larger push towards PBR in games and animation industries. We can characterize physically based rendering as a broad set of techniques and approaches to computer graphics that attempts to reverse engineer physical properties of light and color to develop a standardized, systematized approach to rendering. Much of this reverse engineering focuses on simulated physical properties of objects as represented by shaders, such as whether or not an object is metal, how rough it is, or whether it absorbs or refracts light. PBR derives its name from this simulated physicality. Despite this push towards standardization, though, there is no standard PBR formula or implementation across software packages. Unreal's models, for example, are based upon models developed at Disney for the 2012 film Wreck-It Ralph. However, most PBR models, including Unreal's, center two core physical models of how light and surface interact: microfacet theory and conservation of energy. Microfacet theories abstracts the interaction of a ray of light, surface and subsurface of an object. Light is modeled as a carrier of information. Human vision interprets the color of light due to the angle of light takes to the eye, as well as the qualities the surface of light has bounced off of. Microfacet theory posits that when light rays hit a surface, the resulting directions are determined by how light penetrates the surface membrane and how it's and therefore how its subsurface scatters, and by microfacets or microscopic ridges, deformations, and divots in the surface of an object that deflects light rays. Diffusion can to an object's perceived color, while microfacets affect object's reflectivity. The rougher the object surface is, the more information is reflected relative to the subject. Second, PBR's conservation of energy model splits the material world into a binary of conductive versus insulating materials. Now, this doesn't mean that PBR developers actually believe that there's only two types of materials in the world, but this is our heuristic, right? This is what helps us do quick rules of thumb that create different types of physically based materials. Conductive materials, almost universally metal, have high reflective values and tend to not scatter light, thus offering no diffuse color. Insulators, like most nonmetals, will generally scatter some light, just contributing to a brighter diffuse color. Reflectivity also changes depending on conductivity, with metals sometimes tinting the color of their reflections. Metalness channel for shaders. The value that PBR artists assign, metal or non-metal, fundamentally changes the calculations of the material. So why am I talking about this? Epistemically, right, how we think about what light is. PBR further encourages a shift in digital graphics towards physical simulation and production, and away from what art historian Heinrich Wolffen has called a painterly way of knowing, an affective phenomenological attention to the shape and quality of individual experiences of color. Non-physically based lighting workflows, for example, often selectively apply multiple competing models of color to achieve different visual and affective reactions to the viewer. An artist may choose to follow complementary color shading, in which specular highlights and cast shadows from an object are tinted in complement to an object's diffuse color, thus making an object appear more vibrant. A red apple, for example, might have a slight green tint to its highlight and shadow. While this technique has been used by painters and watercolorists for hundreds of years, and it's phenomenologically correct in that complementary shading impacts human perception of color, it is physically incorrect from a universalized mathematic-based model of color. Simultaneously, individual objects obeying unique rules for specular and shadow color introduce variation unpredictability into the production pipeline, increasing development time and cost, which is especially important for AAA games. As such, painterly elements like shadow color and specular color are often wrested from the artist's control in PBR and are instead handled by algorithmic processes only modifiable by developers and artists who have source level engine access and the requisite programming knowledge to do something with that access. Part of what I'm going to argue here, though, is that PBR's narrative of simulating reality is a fantasy, and it emerges from what physicist Jennifer Scott Weinstein calls white empiricism, or what she calls the presumption that a researcher has an epistemic over objective universal reality, whereas other identities, particularly those of Black women and non-researchers, are often produced as an ontological other, right? That physics kind of has this white male authority that we can often appeal to in order to make rational claims about the universe, whereas other types of authorities are considered less than, or at least less technically important. Scott Weinstein builds upon critical social theorist Patricia Hill Collins, who argues that Black women's thought and vision is epistemically suppressed by the actions and cultures of scientific practice. In scientific practice, white men are constructed as more important and more rational figures. SIGGRAPH argues that processes and outcomes of science are imbued with this kind of masculine ideology, which emerges in practice through what she labels scientist intuition. She labels examples of this intuition as proving the model's universality, positing a world before oneself that discovery is effective, productive, profitable, and exploitable. Now, these cultures in physics trickle down into PBR. PBR's cultural cachet among computer graphics research depends upon its supposed adherence to prestigious models of light and matter from physics, right? Whereas non-physically based models merely look good, PBR is ostensibly real and backed up by scientific thought. PBR's mass adoption across games and cinema is characterized as both a testament to its effectiveness and to the progress of computer graphics as a whole. PBR, in other words, succeeds in part because it clads itself in white male physics' epistemic authority. In the Unreal Engine and PBR, race, and particularly blackness and whiteness, I'm going to argue, are enacted with and through white puricism and libidinal qualities of truth claims. So, how does this actually impact what it means to render whiteness, what it means to render blackness, and how are these histories of rendering different types of skin actually entangled with longer histories of art in the West and that have political and often racist overtones? The future of digital humans, Epic, the developers of Unreal Engine, would tell you, is the MetaHuman Creator Project. This Unreal Engine 5 plugin promises easy integration of pre-rigged lifelike humans into any Unreal developed project. When first downloading and running the Meet the MetaHumans project demo, user presented with a T-posed Black woman. Upon running the simulation, the in-game camera shifts to a close-up of the woman's face. She smiles and introduces herself with a soft British accent. Quote, "I am a metahuman," end quote. The skin around her cheeks puffs and swells as she speaks. Her forehead wrinkles, and she has a pretty convincing looking appearance. As she narrates the strength of the MetaHuman project, she proudly declares that she's, quote, fully rigged, and she continues, "With everything running live on Unreal Engine, my motion works seamlessly," and then suddenly disappears and is replaced by another actor who finishes the sentence on another characters. The transition is somewhat jarring. This is intentional, of course. The ebbs and flows that control the rig, the close-up camera angles, the sudden character swap are all designed to provoke a sense of wonder and therefore sales. But there's another reason why this switch is concerning. The second character rendered as East Asian stands out more in the video than the first character rendered as a Black woman. At first glance, the sharpness of the transition can be explained by a simple color choice. The background of the video is deep gray, and paler skin tones will pop out against that backdrop more than darker ones. But as you look closer, you can see the pop has less to do with the background and more to do with the skin itself. While both characters I think are arguably underlit, the second character's skin is far more vibrant. Highlights help define the features of his face. His midtones and flesh tones never push too far towards white, and his lowlights and shadows don't dissolve into flattened gray or black tones. The diffusion of light just under the surface of the skin gives a slight pinkish undertone. The Black character, on the other hand, features blown out highlights on her skin, and her midtones and appear flat and leaning towards gray. She appears flat and she doesn't shine. The MetaHuman's image emerges through PBR's enactment of Black skin through traditionally a cinematic apparatus, right? A camera and cinematic technologies that have been developed to capture white skin, but not Black skin. The Western cinematic apparatus, many scholars have argued, and I'll talk through some of those today, has long been anti-Black, both materially and ontologically. Materially, the cinematic apparatus produces Black skin as a deviation from white skin and uses Black bodies as edge cases for photography, film, narrative, and digitization. Ontologically, or in terms of how we imagine the real world, the shine of Black skin itself has long taken a site of contestation and violence in a white world. As art historian Krista Thompson argues, the interaction of video light and Black skin actually serves as a contemporary axis for ways of seeing and representing. This light for Thompson is doubly deployed. It was a technique popularized in 80s dance halls by Jamaican videographer Jack Soa, whose camera was affixed with a bright, unfiltered top-mounted light, creating a style whose, quote, visual texture is harsh and burning white, end quote. The proliferation of video light in the Caribbean, Thompson argues, contributed to practice of skin bleaching by dancehall participants in Kingston. Quote, "This controversial practice in which dancehall participants make their bodies and exposed parts of their faces lighter and light sensitive through chemical means stems in part from an effort to be more visible to the scope of video light, to be rendered legible through videographic technologies of light," end quote. So this is really important, right? Because the way that we think about light and skin does more than just represent objects on a cinematic surface. It also changes and materializes practices of skin itself, right? So people modify their skin, often in dangerous ways, in order to become picked up by cameras and by videographic technologies that aren't designed to highlight those skin tones. Thompson explores historical and racialized links between going back as far as Renaissance painting of surfacism and contemporary Black arts practices, ranging from Kehinde Wiley's illuminated paintings to bling fashion. Drawing from art historians John Berger and Svetlana Alpers, Thompson describes surfacism in Dutch and European portraiture as the combination of painting technique and medium that gives painted surfaces and subjects a bright luminescent quality, which was used to connote wealth, prestige, and commodity status. In addition to the selection of objects painted, which came to include marble floors, furs, and baubles, new attention was paid to sheen, shine, and glisten. Alpers argues that, quote, Dutch painters, for the first time in the history of art, attempted to reproduce the optical effect of rays of light hitting the surfaces of the objects in their paintings, end quote. The refractions of painted light were further augmented on the surface of the painting itself, as artists applied copious amounts of shellac to their canvases in order to increase gloss and specularity. Shine and specularity came to represent commodity status through these art projects. The more present they were in one's portrait, the more wealth and prestige the person held. Notably, Thompson observes, the only surface not commonly painted in the surface style was the white skins of the patrons themselves. Patrons were often represented in warmer, less harsh, less glossy light, separating their humanity from that of the objects surrounding them. Representations of Black bodies in surfaces painting, on the other hand, were styled in the same techniques of media as shine and glisten as tradable commodities, leading to, quote, the bodies of persons defined as Black not only literally circulated in the global economy as commodities, but were also visually defined as such through the visual logic of surfacism, end quote. This commodified shine and specularity depicted in surfaces art were replicated in practices of African chattel slavery across Europe at the time, in which the skin and mouths of Black persons for sale were lathered in grease to give a commodified, shiny, healthy appearance. Even pre-film and video then, the language and technique of light and specularity have been used to cast political and ideological desire upon the surface of Black skin. These castings are not just visually representative, they directly impact practice of body as well, right? And so these different types of representations of skin and light and shine, these are not objective, neutral representations of reality. They are all embedded within larger systems of culture and power and representation, right? Who gets to paint, who gets to be represented as an object versus a subject, and how do these things get translated onto the canvas and through the materiality of the different artistic mediums. Thompson's articulations of the Blackness of video light were the start of a longer legacy of interactions between Blacks and the camera lens. Genevieve Yue analyzes China Girls film squares, images of upper bodies of white women surrounded by blocks of color. These film squares were attached to the beginning of film projection strips and were used in aiding projectionist calibrations of light and picture. Just as we've seen in PBR, however, despite being deployed as a universal standard of visual measurement, China Girl, quote unquote, objective skin color is also culturally manipulated. Yue quotes physicist David McAdam, who in his investigations of skin tone and color photography notes that, quote, optimum reproduction of skin color is not an exact reproduction, which is almost unanimously rejected as beefy. When the print of the highest acceptance is compared with the original subject, it seems quite pale, end quote. So what this means is proper white skin, objectively rendered, quote unquote, scare quotes, white skin in photography needed to appear even whiter than it did on the subject's flesh in order to appear to a white audience as natural. The lighting techniques and film chemistry used to produce this whitening of skin have left lasting impressions on the quality of photorealism in Black skin. Lorna Roth has analyzed how diverse Shirley cards in the 90s show different skin tones, also highlight the white-centeredness of the photographic filming apparatus. In one Kodak card from 1996, seen here on the right, three women, one white, one Black, and one Asian, are pictured standing in front of a gray background. The skin and hair of the white model in the center features dynamic range. Shadow provides depth to her features without losing detail. Highlights and shine are dispersed to give shape to her face and detail to her hair while avoiding blowout. The black model is less fortunate. Her underlit hair has lost all definition. Her skin appears flat. Dull highlights muddle her features, and poor low lighting shift her skin's earthier tones towards gray. There's no fill light, or it's improperly used, as her upper silhouette emerges entirely from her blouse while her arms fade into the background. In an attempt to light her as white, the shine and luster removed from her skin. I said earlier that two core techniques that unify the varied practices of PBR are microfacet theory and conservation of energy. Again, how light bounces off the surface and how it penetrates and diffuses within a surface. In their application towards photorealistic rendering, these abstractions of physics, themselves already entangled with white empiricism, become further entangled with white histories and practices of photography and cinema. Within computer graphics, they enact the phenomena of what I call white photorealism, the interweaving of truth claims with the making invisible of the photographic apparatus to produce a photoreality that only feels real to the white eye. Our metahumans' varying skin color, shine, and quality of look owe themselves to PBR's white photorealism. Computer scientist Theodore Kim has explored the historic making invisible of Black and, in general, melanated skin in computer graphics, which, like photography, have over time come to universally enact the body as the white body, particularly when it comes to rendering of skin and hair. Among the major technical contributors to this enactment is subsurface scattering, the rendering of diffuse light in skin, which contributes to the translucency of certain skin types. As Kim argues, the mathematically difficult, computationally intensive translucency problem is, quote, the only dominating visual feature in young white skin, end quote, and yet has taken up a vast majority of digital research over the past 30 years. Reviewing the literature on skin rendering in this context is, quote, a stomach-churning tour of whiteness, according to Kim, end quote. Kim suggests that one possible solution to this issue is the production of more diverse Shirley cards for better graphics that would give digital artists a better frame of reference for lighting and calculating darker skin. However, given the historical material context of Shirley cards themselves, we can see how the availability of a metahuman Shirley wouldn't necessarily have saved our Black character. First, as seen in the diverse Shirley cards of the 1990s, what counts as an accurate representation of human skin depends on who's providing the card. I doubt, for example, that Kodak producers intentionally underlit and grayed out the Black model in their 1996 card. Rather, the color of the model's skin is produced by her skin tone, the lighting in the studio, the camera settings, the printers and ink never stood a chance. Importantly, however, this is not to absolve the human element. Before distribution, some producer at Kodak had to look at the card and its lighting conditions and shrug and say, yeah, that looks about right. This quote unquote about rightness of Black skin and white photorealism still pervades photography. It was evident in Annie Leibowitz's controversial 2020 Vogue photo shoot of gymnast Simone Biles, which left Biles underlit and flattened. We could also see it in Australian cosmetic company Becca's advertisements of Black skin tone friendly foundation, featuring the hand of a white model digitally manipulated to look Black. Not only did the company choose not to hire Black models for their shoot, they also miscolored the manipulated hand, making the palm back of the hand's skin tone same as the color, the same color as it appears for pale white skin, rather than rendering the hand in gradient tones more common to melanated skin. Here again, we see that the logics of the appearance of white skin are assumed to be easily portable to other skin tones and skin types. In addition to the white historical conditions of the photographic apparatus, PBR's reliance on white empiricism for its cultural cachet contrasts with the material realities of photographically representing skin. PBR represents the promise of a universal rendering process capable of producing shaders that visibly work across varying lighting conditions. The claim that human skin is not algorithmically universalizable contradicts PBR's core narrative. Kim, upon presenting his research for review at SIGGRAPH here, even got feedback that pointing out different skin tones in rendering itself was racist. In arguing that all skin must, by definition, have universal light conditions, white skin becomes rendered technical. It is rendered neutral and objective, giving white skin the mathematical prestige of universal skin. Invoking of Black people's skin as having distinct needs thus brings, quote, a bias into the world of computer graphics is perceived as being racist. The correct approach to rendering color, according to some engineers then, is to remain colorblind, right? And this is a problem, right? The assumption that the white body acts as universal, that all other bodies are just derivations of the white body, rather than thinking about how each body and all skin tones, all skin types have different types of graphical and computational needs. Black cinematographers and lighting directors have long known about the quote unquote neutral white apparatus of the camera's inability to capture darker highlights and shines of Black folks' skin. Cinematographer Bradford Young argues that Black people's skin is treated in film as analogous to pure Black fabrics and surfaces, a material that ravenously absorbs any light thrown at it. Attempting to visually brighten dark skin so that it can be rendered as legible as white skin involves overlighting and blowing out the entire scene. Overlighting leads to the washed out flat tones of Black-led 1990s sitcoms like The Cosby Show and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Young observes, quote, Black skin is a very particular level of reflectance and specularity. So here it's actually the opposite. It reflects light, end quote. Like the practice of video light documented by Thompson, a solution to representing Black people's skin in a white cinematic apparatus is to hack the materiality of the apparatus itself to best capture its specularity. Ava Berkowski, director of photography for Issa Rae's Insecure, notes that this hacking occurs across multiple sites. Her own work on Insecure involves applying moisturizer or makeup with reflective minerals onto darker skinned actors, equipping the camera lens with a polarizer to lessen harsh reflections or overlight skin, and using bounce rather than direct lighting rigs. Though Unreal's PBR inherits the white bias of the cinematic apparatus, its use cases' technical capacities make it difficult to replicate these same hacks that are used to better light darker skin. Actor position, camera frame, and spatial configuration allows cinematographers like Berkowski to differently light multiple skin tones and set pieces while preserving visual coherence. In an interactive gaming space or a real-time rendered space where a player has the ability to move throughout the scene, multiple lighting setups would quickly become obvious while also making the scene visually disorienting. The practice of white photorealism from film and photography and cinema are thus reenacted. When universal lighting conditions are needed, they are crafted to the detriment of darker, more reflective skin. These diffractions of whiteness are evident in more popular PBR-based media as well. Gaming communities voiced concern over the whitewashing of Barrett Wallace, a main character in Final Fantasy VII, and one of the only Black characters in the Final Fantasy game series. After promotional screenshots of 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake, an Unreal Engine 4 created remaster of 1997's FF7 showed Barrett with noticeably lighter skin. Similar concerns were voiced over Disney's 3D animated series Star Wars: The Bad Batch, in which animated clone soldier characters based off Maori actor Tamura Morrison were rendered with pale skin. Although The Bad Batch uses pre-rendered animation, it uses the same Disney principled shader from which Unreal's PBR shaders are derived. In both instances, developers blame the lighting system rather than the artists. Reddit threads filled with vitriol against quote unquote race-baiting cultural critics, end quote, consistently pointed to Unreal to justify that skin tone, arguing that his whitewashing is merely, quote, a trick of the light, end quote, in the in-game lighting engine. Disney, to their credit, altered the appearance of the clone soldiers to better reflect Morrison's appearance, but was also very careful to avoid the use of any body or skin-centered language. Instead, they identified the lighting schema as the cause of the audience's concerns. Geek culture website IO9, for example, reported, a source familiar with the production of The Bad Batch told IO9 that in the run-up to its premiere this week, changes to the lighting tools used by the animation team were made to moderate their effects in premiere episode's starkly lit primary settings. Such tweaks will be made in future episodes of the series. PBR here thus plays a shifting cultural role in white photorealism. Sometimes PBR is discussed as sacrosanct, a neutral objective system of mimesis whose errors are only in the eye of the viewer, a trick of the light. At other times, it's invoked as a system in progress, an apparatus approaching universal truth, but which still has unintended consequences. In both cases, PBR is articulated in a way that absolves digital artists and programmers from accusations of anti-Black aesthetic bias, or what Imani Perry has called post-intentional racism. No individual artists lightened or faded metahumans, Barrett's, or clone sculptures' skin, the argument goes. Rather, variables spread throughout the renderer produce paler skin regardless of artist intent. By this argument, whitewashing was a systemic product rather than an intentional aesthetic choice. Disney does not see the problem in the first place, reinforces that white photorealism's reliance on good enough when it comes to darker skin. Just to wrap up, beyond light, current ontologies of matter baked into Unreal's PBR countermand the material condition of dark skin. The embedded conservation of energy reflectance diffusion model fundamental to PBR states that the more specular a surface is, the less diffuse color a surface exhibits. As materials get shinier, they tend to get darker. This rough calculation already introduces aesthetic concerns in rendering darker skin, in which both shine and range of color expression are key elements. Even more fundamental, though, is the ontology or the reality of metalness in PBR's conservation of energy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, metals are conductors. Their electroconductive properties make them visually behave in notably different ways than dielectric or insulating materials. They are highly reflective, exhibit little to no subsurface scattering, and their specular highlights and reflections have a colored tint. This last feature especially makes conductors oddities in PBR, which by default tends to render specular values as kind of a neutral white light. As such, physically based renderers need to determine whether or not a material is conductive or insulating in order to appropriately calculate light and shading. As most everyday conductors are metals, artist-friendly principled shading models use the binary metalness property as a proxy for conductivity, allowing artists to select which rendering model to use. This metalness attribute, however, makes invisible one of the most common everyday conductors that we encounter in the human world: melanin. Melanin, present in all human skin, hair, and the human brain, is one of the only known biological materials that exhibits conductive properties. Its potential use as an energy-efficient conductor in architecture, biomaterials, and green energy is only beginning to be explored. Western science has known for some time that melanin concentrations impact the diffusion and scattering of ultraviolet light. But for all of its universality in the human body, melanin's visual properties, and particularly its properties when present in high concentrations of melanocytes that result in darker skin, have been shockingly understudied. This understudy of the visual effects of melanin, coupled with a general lack of attentiveness to the deep needs of dark skin, has already contributed to public and embarrassing faux pas by technology companies. These faux pas include the now famous green light problem in smartwatches and health trackers, where optical sensors using a green LED light reflectance as a measuring tool often fail on darker skin due to melanin's higher green absorption index. Even user-made modifications to the Unreal skin shaders to introduce melanin properties tend to model melanin as just brownness or pigmentation. These properties lead skin simulations that render melanated skin as underspecular and reddened. The invisibility of melanin in white photorealism leads artists and developers to treat darker skin as simply darker or dyed white skin, rather than as a surface with unique material and visual needs. This invisibility manifests in multiple ways. Mimetically, black skin just doesn't look right. Cinematically, lighting practices that can help better represent blackness are either underutilized or discouraged. Ontologically, how skin is materialized in reference dismisses one of the most important factors in skin color and specularity for anyone not white, right? The high concentration of melanin. PBR's borrowing of the cultural cachet of physics allows for these political and aesthetic issues to be rendered technical, in that the problem will assume to be solved as universal skin and lighting models advance. Thus, no special attention is paid to darker skin tones. Ironically, one possible technical remedy, the incorporation of melanin's conductivity into skin shaders, is already fraught with epistemic and political tension. Like the surfaces art projects highlighted by Thompson, ways of representing blackness are already entangled with representing minerality and commodity. In PBR, perhaps in order to make black skin more electroconductive, more absorbent, and more visible, we must make it more metal. And that in itself introduces a whole range of problematic associations with commodity status and the objectification of Black bodies and Black persons. Thank you very much.